Hey, good morning, everyone. Welcome in. All right. I think we're still filtering a few more folks in. Thank you, everyone, for joining this morning. So today we're going to be kind of diving into, for the most part, walking through some of the FAQs. I think we released those this morning. So if we can we also place those in this chat for, I think Beth, if you could just pop them into this chat just so folks have easy access to the FAQs that we sent out. I know sometimes they have to filter down to the right person too when we send them out. So if we could pop those in. We're going to walk through the FAQs this morning and then just kind of have open dialogue for anyone that has questions. Totally okay if you have like very specific community questions. 9 times out of 10, if you have a very specific community question, someone else also has a very similar question. So don't be afraid of asking something that sounds like it's very specific to your needs. So we'll get kicked off. We've got a group of OHCS staff here, so we might need to have folks jump in, answer a question that's a little bit more in the weeds. But today we're talking about the budget analysis tool. So we did a kind of in-depth series, 2 webinars last week to release this information. So there should be sort of that information available. We sent that out as well over email. So you can watch both of those recordings. And each of them obviously were slightly different in conversation because the questions that we're asked were slightly different. So we essentially took questions from those webinars and made them into FAQs, so you didn't have to read through or watch the Zoom webinars, and then really just tried to put a fine-tooth comb on every kind of answer there. So with that, we'll get started. Oh, I also didn't introduce myself. Sorry. My name's Mike Savara. He, him, his pronouns. I'm the Special Initiatives Director at OHCS. So thanks for kicking us off. I'm going to share my screen with the FAQ tool. I just wanted to touch on a few of the kind of key ones that I think are pretty nuanced that I think will be helpful for folks as you're filling out your budget analysis tool. So I'm not going to touch on all of these. Obviously, some of these are going to be kind of high level. I think one thing to mention too is that I see a lot of folks that maybe from community action agencies. You work at one of the 18 community action agencies across the state. I think one thing that we wanted to make sure to message is that we're only asking for this process for funds that are one-time in nature that we've identified that we received in this current biennium. So you receive other programs, obviously are really critical programs. We're not at this point really focusing on those programs to get a better sense for what those dollars do. We're really just trying to make sure that we're focused in on making sure that we're making a good case for why the one-time dollars that OHCS has received and deployed throughout the state, what the cost would be to continue those services. So just wanted to mention that for folks that are kind of like, wait a minute, you're missing like half of the dollars flowing into our community. We know it's okay. We're just trying to focus on some of these dollars that are one-time in nature. We've gotten quite a few questions from folks that have said, hey, there's an error in my tab, or there was a missing program, or you just sent an email last week saying you're going to get some more funding, but it wasn't included in our tab. We definitely want to make sure that we're getting these right. I think we've addressed all of those questions that we've received as of yesterday afternoon. So we've issued new tools. So that's just something to be aware of. Is if you see an area of your document that looks different than what you were expecting, like for instance, maybe there's a missing level of investment. There's just like money that you received, or you are expecting to receive, and it's just not included, please reach out to us if that's the case. We can really quickly kind of turn around a new tab, and then hopefully it's not too big of a disruption as far as your process goes to actually input the information. So don't be afraid if you're like even just like not sure if everything's accurate. We want to make sure that we're capturing everything. The other piece to this too is if you're missing like an entire tab, like we had one community that just recently got some shelter funding. They didn't have any shelter funding before. We didn't add them as having a shelter tab because we just missed it in our overview. We're trying to get 43 of these documents out in very short period of time and just made a couple of errors. So want to make sure that we're getting this right. So if you see anything, feel like anything is off, just reach out. Don't feel like it's any kind of a bother, and we'll address it as quickly as possible. So I believe we've gotten all of these out. If you have not received a workbook or your agency has not received a workbook, please reach out as well. I want to make sure that you've gotten that. Again, you would have received, if you're a community action agency and you're also responsible for the executive order funding or receiving your role as a COC lead, you would have received two different budget tools, one for prevention and one for everything else. So that could have been the case where we want to make sure you're getting both of those if that is indeed your role. There's also organizations that are culturally specific or culturally responsible organizations that may have received both tools. So just want to make sure that if you are expecting both prevention and, for instance, rehousing funding, you should have received two different tools. A couple other things I wanted to touch on. So there's a really good discussion, I think, in the second webinar that we did. That was folks were starting to kind of dig into the numbers, and they realized that as they added up the number of, for instance, shelter beds that we had funded, the number of shelter beds we had funded was maybe greater than the number of beds that they created. And that's because we were looking at the number of beds that each investment created or sustained rather than the cumulative number for that community. And so that was just our attempt at trying to line up how much money, for instance, House Bill 5019 invested to create, say, 100 shelter beds, and then how much money Senate Bill 5511, the sustaining or year two dollars, actually created. And so instead of having those be as, sort of lined up in a way that would have allowed for you to see, the throughput and then the final number, we just added them all in so you had visibility. But that's also pretty confusing because you need to pick your actual, final number of shelter beds. So wanted to make sure that that was clear. We tried to provide sort of an explanation of that. If you're like, this isn't right, just input the correct number. You know how many beds you've created at this point fairly well, I imagine. So in your section below, just input whatever you believe is the number of beds that you'll need sustained as a result of these investments. And so definitely don't feel like you need to stick with what is in the above sections for those areas, especially if it looks like we're counting people twice because of the way the dollars are lined up. So we want to make sure that we're getting that number right, and your estimates for your community in terms of how many folks you've rehoused or how many folks you will rehouse are likely to be spot on. So definitely want to make sure that you're able to do that. Any questions on this one? I know this is a little bit wonky, so I want to pause here and just see if there's any specific questions. See if I can pull up the chat.
It's Doug Green with Social Services. I just wanted to just clarify real quickly. So like we have one that has to do with prevention, obviously, here. That was the only tool we got. And so the upper section has three funding sources, adds up to 1,218 households on ours. And down below, that number has been plugged into the region's estimate. But is that that number you're saying is one that we want to update with the actual number of beds?
Exactly. Yeah, that's exactly right. So likely on that one, your like House Bill 5019 investment created the certain number of beds, and then 5511 sustained those beds, but you didn't get new beds with 5511. So you would just want to make sure that it's the actual number. It's sort of a way of saying year one, year two, it sustained those specific number of beds, but it's not as clean as that in some ways. So yeah, definitely just go with whatever your your actual number is for that community. Cody, I see your hand.
Hi, Cody Thomas, Clackamas County. I have a question regarding the overlap for rapid rehousing and the long-term rent assistance program. So for us, we had 170 households served with rapid rehousing through House Bill 5019 funds. Majority of them will be moving on to long-term rent assistance. How do you want us to account for those, considering they were served through rapid rehousing and will also be served through long-term rent assistance? Right now, the number is just adding the total 170 for each category. Should
Right.
I subtract the number that will be moving on to LTRA from the 5019 number, or?
Yeah, good call. So same problem in a sense with the shelter funds, right? In a lot of ways. So what we're looking for is how many households do we need to sustain in 2025, 2027? So your LTRA number is likely the right number to use for that, because I imagine there's going to be a certain number of folks that you served under House Bill 5019 that won't need the LTRA. Maybe they got a Section 8 voucher or something else, and they're set. They don't need the ongoing assistance. So it's really just that LTRA number is likely to be your most accurate estimate there.
Perfect. Yeah, because some will continue to be served through rapid rehousing. Most are going on to LTRA. Um, for the number of households, so I could just update that to the correct number, because our LTRA number is a little outdated here. So just
Yeah, I
update
know
it to
it's
the most
also
accurate number. Cool.
you're developing the program as you're getting it. So that, yeah, that's
Cool.
perfect. Whatever you believe your kind of most accurate number will be, just input that. And then yeah,
Thank you.
we put in for the LTRA investment, like how much money you would be getting. We're also still working on finalizing those details, of course. And so we put in what we thought before your estimate amount was. That's also obviously subject to change slightly. And so if you want to talk more through that, we can definitely chat through like the precise number that we'll be giving. I think in the next week or two, we're hoping to finalize those numbers and solidify the LTRA numbers as well for this biennium. So should help
Cody, you
in
guys
the future.
got
But
a new.
you should be fairly close on the money there.
Sorry, Mike. Cody, you guys got a new workbook yesterday too.
Yes, yeah,
Because you're with Clackamas, right?
I'm
Okay.
working
I
on
just
that.
want
We
to make
got
sure.
added the shelter tab.
Okay.
Thank you so much for sending that.
Okay. Yeah, cool. Thank you. Sorry that was a little bit confusing.
No worries. It was a super last second ad, so thank you.
Okay, cool.
And then I see Jan's question here. So yeah, with the ORI funds, so ORI is the Oregon Rehousing Initiative. That's the second year rehousing program for the executive order. ORI is a little bit funny as well. So ORI is, as folks are probably aware, has the ability to extend beyond this current biennium. It's not only general funds. So we have the ability to go into 2025, 2027. So what we're asking for ORI is, if you think there are additional dollars that you need in order to sustain that estimated number of households that you've been committed to serving under ORI, then tell us what those are. But as far as the households served, I would include them as part of the estimate, because they're going to be part of who we're looking to make sure has stable housing. Because more than likely there will be a portion of those ORI households, if we get additional dollars, a portion of those ORI households will also need to transition to an LTRA program, right? They'll transition to a longer term program beyond the 24 months. And so similar to the 5019 to LTRA transition, this biennium, our vision is basically that there's a level of transition happening from folks that get rapid rehousing under ORI into an LTRA program. And so that's sort of the long-term hope, is that we have sort of options for folks that need the longer term assistance to move from ORI into an LTRA program. So every community kind of has a pathway to get folks, off the streets, through shelter, and into permanent housing. So definitely, consider that as you're looking through what your potential additional needs beyond what you've got with ORI is now. All right, and then I saw a couple questions. I want to jump back to questions around the current funding tab. I think Dina and Jan both asked for the EHA, ESG, et cetera, the current funding. So what I would recommend on this one is that you all, when you submitted your original House Bill 5019 current services tab, you gave us your estimates of what money was going into the community. My recommendation is to just use those same numbers if you don't have updated figures available in a short period of time, rather than sort of recreating the wheel. For the purposes of this, that is more than sufficient, what you provided last year. We just wanted to make sure that you had an opportunity to update them if things did change drastically. So if you are a local planning group or a MAC group, you likely would have submitted that House Bill 5019 tool, and in one of the first tabs, it actually has the same question, more or less. It's structured slightly differently, but it should be useful for filling this out. So that's what I would recommend for this, because it isn't as critical to get that right exactly where your community is right now. It's just really a way for us to say, well, how much of this money that we're talking about is part of your system? Could be a little portion, it could be a lot of it. So does that help at all, Dina? I see your hand.
A little, I guess. My new question, now that we've talked about it, is on the current funding tab, is that really just talking about funding, additional funding that either we got or our partners got, just to operate this new capacity numbers? Or is it our overall, everything we got, everything everybody got in 23-25?
Overall, yeah, it's really just like bird's eye view of what money goes into your system for homelessness. So, and that's why it's okay for it to be, that is a difficult number to quantify at times, especially with multiple funding streams: federal, COC, state, local funds. So that's really all we're hoping to do, is just get a sense for the proportion between other funding and these dollars that we're looking at right now. And so that's why using that like prior tool could just be an easy way of going. So yeah, hopefully that helps. Just looking at that overall view.
Well, just one last detail. So if we do just, combine all of our EHA, HSP, SHAP kind of dollars onto that current tab, where would you recommend we put it? What column? Yeah. Like federal for ESG kind of money and TBA? Where would we put this? Because I noticed there's one column that says not including OHCS funds, so I was confused by that.
Yeah, no, that section's definitely a little unclear. So I would say for those, actually, I'm going to see if Kay can jump on. I just saw her hand up. She might have a better way of explaining this than I will.
Thanks, Mike. And can you pull it up on the screen? Can we screen share the current funding tab?
Yes, 1 second.
And so I wanted to mention that on the current funding tab, it's broken out by program area. So for example, if you're getting federal funding towards eviction prevention, or if you're getting local funding for shelter, then you would put that in the respective cells for the column that the funding source originates from, and then the row that the funding goes towards. And so we delineated between state funding that is not OHCS funding. Maybe you got ODHS funding, or you received funding from some other source outside of OHCS. And then the last column is just any other additional funding sources. These could be like private foundations, fundraising, or anything that's not anything that's not captured within the rest of the column. And so I wanted to ask about the question that was just previously asked about I believe it's column F, for the 23-25 other state funding that does not include OHCS. Was that your question? Just wanted to make sure.
Yeah, my question is really EHA or SHAP as examples comes from OHCS. No, it's not part of what you put in preloaded in our budget because it's not one-time funding. But it does come from OHCS. And if we use it for prevention or we use it for rehousing and plan to continue, what column would we put it in? Or what column do we put it in for, that's what we use? Is it additional? Is it other state or just OHCS funding?
It could be other state. Yes, it could be other state if it's EHA, SHAP.
Okay.
The OHCS funding that we provide is just for the funding that you have received as identified in your respective tabs for the specific program areas. So the House Bill 5019, Senate Bill 5511, Senate Bill 1530, ORI, which is Senate Bill 5701. So you're able to put your additional funding from OHCS in either the 23-25 other state funding or 23-25 additional funding. We aren't auditing this page. This is really just for like information gathering to see what funds are available out there. So where you put the funding on this, I think is not something that we're going to be like inspecting super closely or auditing or anything. As long as we're just like capturing what funding is available so that we can see sort of the overall makeup and composition of the funding and the percentages that are coming from different areas and in different programs.
Awesome. I see a couple other hands and want to see Melissa, see your hand up, and then Melanie, I see you off mute too.
Hi, yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so I had a question on those SB 1530 funds. And they're listed under, we also have the eviction prevention one, so they're also listed under eviction prevention, and we're not really sure what that is. Or where that's coming from, what eviction prevention funds are those?
The oh yeah, so SB 1530 are new funds actually that OHCS is currently working on deploying. The dollars came from the special or the short session in February of 2024, and the team is working on amending and adding the grant agreements to community action agencies contracts right now. So we're really trying to make sure that those dollars are getting out. The number of households is based off of the prior round of per household cost. So essentially, instead of kind of going back and forth and doing the household figures again, we just assumed that it's a plus up of 5511 for the rest of the biennium. You just haven't received it yet, but I believe the allocation workbook was sent out. I'll see if the prevention team on the call can confirm that or can get a timeline for when those allocation workbooks will be sent out.
Okay, so that's for the rest of the 23-25.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah. It's just a little bit more funding beyond 5511. The legislature essentially recognized that the 5511 wasn't going to really reach all the need. So they added a little bit more this biennium.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Prevention team, any context on the allocation workbook email?
I can hop in. This is Odalis Perez. I think Alina is here, but those allocation amounts have yet been emailed out to providers. So we're hoping to do that tail end of this week or early next week.
Yes, this is Alina Pollock. I'm here and I agree, Odalis. Thank you.
And the number that's in your workbook, like the number right here, is, I mean, no secret here, is the number that will be in your allocation workbook, minus the admin. So you'll get this number plus admin. That's literally where it's coming from. So just wanted to make sure that folks have the ability to project that as part of the cost, because you haven't actually gotten the workbook yet. Lynn, I see your hand.
So while we're on funding, so what you just said, the SB 1530, that is not the funding that went directly to shelter providers. That is a new allocation.
Okay, so SB 15, good question. SB 1530 had two different purposes. It's one of those bills that had multiple areas. So if you're a community action agency, you'll receive SB 1530 funds under ORDAP, the prevention side. But then if you're a COC or a local planning group, you'll also be receiving the SB 1530 funds as part of the $65 million investment the legislature made this biennium in February short session to sustain additional shelters where there are shelter operational gaps. So it's essentially two prongs of the investment. Will do both of those things. And so depending on the tab you're looking at, like if you're looking under shelter, you'll see 1530 come up under this amount. And that's where we added those dollars as what your community will likely receive for all of those shelters that are not part of the EO, but previously we're getting dollars directly from OHCS to those shelter operators. But by and large, we're shifting to a model where we're funding the COCs or the local planning groups, and then they will be funding down to the shelter operators. And that's what the shift is right now that's happening between the 24.1 million shelter operations dollars and the current next year. And so that's kind of the shift that's happening. Does that make sense, Lynn?
So there was just two numbers that I didn't know, and that was one of them. And I just assumed it was those funds that were passing through directly to shelter providers. But I thank you for that explanation. And then in the shelter tab, the one right above it, which is non-EO estimates for the SB 5511, that one also I'm not able to reconcile with funding that came directly to our community.
Exactly. You wouldn't have received that directly in your community. It's what OHCS has allocated to shelters in your region. So if you're Lane County, we've allocated it to the specific number of shelters in your community through that $24.1 million. It didn't flow through the COC structure or you as a community action agency. It went directly to those shelter operators this last year. We would have deployed it last October, December kind of range. And that's why it's money that went to your community, but it didn't go through your region, if that makes sense.
And then one last question, I promise it'll be my last about this funding. There was one of the funding totals that appeared to have an admin included in it in the rehousing section, the SB or the LTRA, appeared to have what we believe to be administrative included. And is that just an error, or was there a reason for that, or am I just wrong on my numbers?
That's a good question. Kay or Odalis, do you want to jump in on that one? I'm not sure.
And I can send
so
it.
So the LTRA funds do include the admin amount because the admin that was advanced to regions was used for their community planning process, and was sent out initially. And so the LTRA amount does include both the program amount that will be coming and then the advanced amount for the community planning process.
So in the question regarding administrative costs, that would be on top of what's there, or that initial million whatever of admin. I guess
I'm sorry,
Are we-
could you repeat that?
so there's a question on the administrative cost on line 13 for the rehousing. I'm just looking at that one. And the question is, are we building admin on top of that? That's the full total of admin program since the initial administration was for planning?
So the amount, the amounts that you're putting in the cost estimate information table, those are based off what you think your region needs for the 25-27 biennium. Okay. For the households or shelter beds that you will be serving. The funding breakdown table at the top is a way for us to be able to let regions know and grantees know what specific funding they've received for us. That feedback that we've gotten repeatedly is that, you know, regions, the grantees want to know what all have we sent them. And so that's why we provided the funding table at the top. But the cost estimate table, you can use that information in the funding breakdown as a way to inform your baseline or inform your projections. But the questions that are in that table for the cost estimates will be based on what you believe you need to do for that program area for the whole 25-27 biennium.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's what we're doing, but we are, you know, we have to start somewhere, and that's
sure, yeah.
Reason, so
and I would just jump in really quick on that. So it sounds like we did make you know, an error on this piece, because this says amount does not include admin, but for LTRA, it sounds like we included the admin because of the funkiness with the 15% advance, which isn't admin, it's capacity planning dollars. So I would say just factor that in, that for LTRA, we've included your full allocation. And so if you're looking at that, just know that included the admin dollars. We didn't subtract admin from that. So apologies on the sort of mix up there.
Thank you.
Also, Mike, I wanted to flag that. So when we sent these templates out, it's two separate sets for the CAAs doing prevention work, or the COCs that are operating as CAAs doing prevention work. And so the prevention tab itself is a standalone document. And that is the only tab, that document itself that you receive, that does include admin. And you can see that it says total allocation. And the reason for that is that in the COC work, it's all commingled. And so it's very hard to tease out, you know, the specific admin costs for shelter versus rehousing, because it's all commingled and it's like commingled and then teased apart. So it's not like the straight 15% for each region, for each program area. And so for the prevention, for CAAs though, who receive prevention dollars, they did receive their total allocation. And if we go to the prevention tab, Mike, you can see in column C here in cell C2, it says 23-25 biennium total allocation. So CAAs receiving prevention dollars, that is always just a straight split of the 15% admin, 85% program, which is very different than COC work. And so for CAAs or grantees receiving prevention dollars, this will have your total allocation. And you can see that in cell C2, it's total allocation.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And then I think the order of operations here, Cody, I think you're up next, and then Melissa and Monica after that.
Yeah, just another funding question / comment. Our requests for funding under SB 5511 and ORI were for our total program costs. And so the amounts on here that do not include admin are actually lower than the amounts that our service providers needed in order to deliver the programming. I believe this was communicated by Vahid and Adam. So we are passing through more than this amount. Like just our outreach, for example, has 1.36 million on here. Our total allocation with our admin was 1.6. We're passing through the full 1.6 to our service providers. How should we account for that difference in this planning tool? Move forward, assuming the 1.6 is going to be needed to sustain programming, because we know that's the reality on the ground, and then add admin on top of that?
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah,
perfect.
just add in whatever the actual cost is, even if your current biennium investment didn't meet all the needs, and you had to, sounds like you had to maybe subsidize it with other resources or something. So yeah, I would just add in that as far as the below part where you add in total average administrative cost, just include that as part of, you know, hey, we got this much money. If you can add a little note there,
I was planning on
why it's higher, why it went up in a sense, because it'll just help us understand. Oh, got it. You know, they did. I know we had that kind of misunderstanding during the 5511 about admin and how much it went in, and so want to make sure we're getting that corrected.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you. And just as part of that, the under additional information requested, the pass-through award costs, if applicable, the what percentage of administrative costs outlined. So essentially, is that just gonna be our share of admin, like the percentage of that when we're including all of the admin for our service providers as well? How much of that is our internal admin?
Yep, exactly.
Okay,
so
perfect.
like let's give a scenario. So let's say we give, you know, $100,000 to an agency, and 15% of that is the maximum allowed admin for the grant. Your agency is going to take a specific number of dollars out of that for your own internal costs, and we don't always know what that is. Honestly, it's not something we typically have tracked historically, or really have any sense for what the burden is across the state to actually do the pass-through work. And so we wanted to get a better understanding for our own purposes for the future. And so if your total admin that you'll need is 15%, so $15,000 off that $100,000 grant, that's what you'll put here. You're not going to want to, you know, duplicate anything, any of that. But then you're going to tell us, of that 15K, $5,000 is going to be what we'll need for the pass-through award costs. We're going to hold back 5K in order to make sure that we have the ability to do our job and pass the dollars down. And so that's really what we're trying to get at here. It's you know, this number is going to be included in this monthly average cost above, because both of those costs go together as far as your overall admin. Really what we're asking it here is a little bit more detail. Tease out for us, how much does it actually cost you to run a grant like this? You know, what are the actual costs? And then we can start to get some averages and start to understand, oh yeah, in general, it costs, you know, most governments or nonprofits that are doing this work of passing through 2 to 5% or something like that. And it just helps us better understand what future administrative costs should look like.
Awesome. Thank you.
Melissa, I think you're next up.
Yeah, actually, kind of where you're sharing your screen, you're on it. But in that area where it says inflation and cost increases, in the frequently asked questions, there was a section where it looked like it was saying not to calculate for inflation or cost increases because OHCS would be doing that. So.
Yep. I can get on that. Yeah, good call. So, and this came up in this second webinar. I think someone asked more questions about this. So what we mean is in this section above, where you're estimating your future costs, you don't need to try and forecast how much more money you'll need just as a result of inflation. Just act as if inflation is flat for this section here. And then tell us below, what do you think some of those factors are? Like, just tell us more information about, you know, what trends you've seen. Maybe like you've noticed that your staffing costs have shot up faster than, you know, some of the other costs in your region. So give us more context on how inflation factors into your thinking for future, but don't feel like you have to nail it for the above section, because what we're going to do is we're going to take all of your input and ideas and concepts for how you think about inflation and how you've historically dealt with that. And then we're going to look at the overall amount of different cost categories. So an example is staffing may raise higher inflation, may increase higher than goods, for instance. And so we want to be able to look at in aggregate, well, 60% of our budget is staffing. And so we need to apply what economists think will be the staffing inflation cost to 60% of our budget. 40% of our budget is goods. And so we think it's going to just be based off of consumer price index for the rest of the 40%. But we're hoping to do that in aggregate so that you don't have to become an economist and think through what the next 3 years will look like. So we're going to rely on kind of our own internal budget and economist teams to be able to kind of project a little bit more in the macro sense. And we want to use your expertise and knowledge on the ground of some of the unique local factors in this section below to really get at what things we should think about there.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Monica, I think you're up next.
Thanks. So on our shelter details tab, there's 177 beds, but then on our shelter tab, it references 244 beds. And the difference is 67, which appears to be the Senate Bill 5511 funding. So is that saying that through that Senate Bill 5511 funding, we're gonna be increasing our bed capacity by another 67?
Oh, good question.
Because that amount is very small for 67 beds.
Okay. Kate, could you jump in on that one? I think that relates to the operational beds versus the EO beds.
Yeah. So on this tab, we identified the shelters that grantees have identified to us. And so the number of total beds at location in column C, which includes only the OHCS funded beds, these are the unduplicated beds. And what I mean by that is that, so for the non-EO funding for Senate Bill 5511 and 1530, those bills for many shelters funded the same beds. So they, let's say they're receiving funding from both Senate bills, and both Senate bills are they're contributing towards the same 50 beds. Technically, that is funding towards, it's funding operations overall for 50 beds each if we were looking at by the funding bill. But in this list, it's unduplicated. So even though it were 50 for each of the bills, each of the Senate bills, it would only show 50 here instead of 100. So it's the unduplicated amount. And that's for the 5511 and 1530 non-EO bills only.
Makes no sense. I'm sorry. That still does not make sense to me.
I think maybe I can try.
I don't know if Giovanni's on the call, maybe, or Colt.
Yeah, well, let me jump in real quick. I think I'm getting the gist here. So, let's kind of put in some numbers just to kind of bring it down to an example. So let's say that OHCS funded 100 beds in your community using the direct to shelter operators. We didn't go through the COCs or the MAC group structures. We just went directly to 100 unique shelter beds to sustain those. Well, that money is going to end on June 30th of this year. There won't be additional funds. So 1530, the next wave of the 65 million that we just got in February, is going to need to sustain that same number of beds. But in some communities, there were ineligible beds that we did not fund under the 24.1 that are eligible now under a broader definition on the 65. So it's possible that there's 100 beds that will need to be sustained that were already counted under the 5511 for the first year, but we're also going to add in maybe another 20 beds to get to 120 beds for these two. But these two are duplicative. They're adding together when really there's only a total of 120 beds in that community. So that's the number that you would be trying to estimate for the future is 120 beds in this scenario, not 220, because these 100 are counted twice, once for the first year and another time for the second year. They're different appropriations that we wanted to make sure you had visibility that those beds were funded and the specific number of beds. And then in the shelter details tab, the reason it's lower is because it's just literally saying like, okay, shelter XYZ, we funded a total number of 50 beds. Shelter, A, B, C, we funded another total of 50 beds. But it's not adding together the 5511 and 1530. It's just keeping them as a distinct count. So that's why the duplicative piece is tricky. We probably could have displayed this differently in retrospect. We were trying to think, oh, more information is better, but I think by adding them together, we sort of created a bit more of a complex, way to look at it. So do apologize on that. But Monica, does that land at all?
I think it helps a little bit. I guess,
Monica, you also got a new workbook yesterday.
yeah, that's the one I'm looking at.
Okay, I just want to make sure. Okay, cool.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, and so thank you. And so I guess one of the questions is because we don't want to create consternation amongst those partners that have been receiving this fund and now it's coming through us, but we have no insight in regards to of all of those beds that were previously being funded and now that funding is coming through us, how much each of those organizations had been receiving and expect to continue to receive.
Okay, that makes sense. Let me see if Giovanni or Holt are on the call. They are the ones that manage that side of the work. You should have received, and it sounds like you didn't, a document that specifically lays out like the beds that we funded under the 24.1 and how much money we gave each of those based on their monthly average cost that you could use as the projection, basically. It looks like Colt sent Jan one, but I don't know that everyone has received that. It sounds like, Monica, you have not. So
yeah,
we'll
I
need to get
don't,
you that.
that doesn't sound familiar. So yeah,
Okay.
if we could get a copy of that, that would be great. Thank
Yeah,
you.
that is sort of a critical part of the equation. I get what you're
Yeah.
saying.
Yeah, and Mike, I wanted to say that as well, which is that once grantees receive their list of shelters that are being funded by the non-EO 5511 and 1530 funding, they'll be able to see and cross-reference with the shelter details tab the non-EO shelters. And so what I was trying to explain before is that, if let's say a shelter is getting funding from 5511 and 1530, both of those bills are funding the same 10 beds at the shelter. In the funding breakdown, it will show the 10 beds for each of those bills that are being funded. But in the shelter details tab, because this is a different cross section, in the shelters details tab, it will only show the 10 beds at that shelter that are being funded, because it's not 20 beds really that are being funded, it's 10. But each of the bills are funding those 10. And that's why it shows in the funding breakdown tab on, or the funding breakdown table in the shelter tab. So it's different cross sections. It's like different perspectives. And once you get your list of the 1530 and 5511 shelters, you'll be able to see, and Mike, can you go back to the shelter details tab? You'll be able to see there where it says if the funding type in column D, if it's EO or non-EO funded. And so if it's non-EO, it's one of those 5511 or 1530 shelters. And the list that you get should show how much each shelter is getting from 5511 versus 1530, and the amount of beds that it's funding respectively. And the reason that we have these two cross sections also is that even though many shelters did receive funding from both bills, there were a lot of shelters that did not. So there were some shelters that only received it for 1530 or only received 5511. But then at the same time, that region was still receiving funding from both bills for different shelters. So it's pretty wonky when you're looking at all the different regions and all the different allocations and all the shelters. And that's why we provided multiple cross sections between the shelter tab and the details.
Thanks, Kay. And I'll just add too, if anyone has not received that list that we're talking about for the 24.1 million, it's going to be really hard to do this task without that. Please reach out to us or just pop your name in the chat and say, hey, haven't gotten it yet, and we'll make sure to get those ASAP. All right, we're on it, Monica, for that one. Thanks. Okay. Any other questions for now? I want to see, and then we can keep running through this doc if there isn't. Okay. I'm gonna. Oh, Melanie, I see your hand.
I have a question that is related to the whole thing of it all with timelines. Having to go to all of the partners is like specifically around the current funding piece. And I guess I feel like however you're saying it doesn't have to be perfect. I think it's a critical piece for us to have, and it's a critical piece for OHCS to have to like acknowledge how much of the funding is coming through OHCS with having really these questions popping up. We got the spreadsheet last week. These questions popping up now, some people not even having the information that they need from the 24.1 and the $65 million shelter, not really knowing what other information OHCS has been able to gather through the exploratory work that they are doing about other shelters on the ground. That $65 million shelter piece is going to be huge in this. And not really having a good understanding of what that is. And it's a long weekend. The 28th feels really short for us to have good information to provide you guys. And I'm wondering if you can tell us why that timeline is there, or if there's any flexibility.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that, Melanie. Yeah, so the process for getting to like a governor's recommended budget and to the final legislatively adopted budget for next year is pretty tight with like where essentially the law requires like budget pieces. So at the end of this month, there will be a economic forecast that the enterprise, the executive branch will conduct, that basically says, here's how much money we think will be available for through tax revenues over the next 3 years for the next biennium. That sets the clock basically for us to say, well, here's what our agency request budgets will be. And those are all due like across the whole enterprise to the governor's office on May 31st. So that's the timeline. Like we just have to get a set of numbers to the DAS is the agency that sort of facilitates this on May 31st, which is obviously a ridiculously tight turnaround. And we don't, so that's why we just don't have a lot of wiggle room between the 28th and the 31st, because we essentially have to add up all of these numbers and then make sure that our projections for each of the line items sort of make sense, and then look at the inflation pieces that we've been talking about. So it just doesn't leave us a ton of time, frankly, to get all of that analysis done without getting, a couple days to see the numbers. And that's really like where I would just say like this has to just be one of those times where it's like, if you can't get, say, for instance, this tab by the 28th, that is okay. I would recommend, honestly, if you had to triage your time and say, you know what, this is going to take a lot of work to look at all the things, get this tab to us at a later date, right? And focus on these critical pieces, you know, the shelter and the prevention, and those other context pieces, because that's really what's going to drive our request, how much money we're going to ask for in the agency request budget. I totally agree. The current funding really helps make the case, like it helps make our argument stronger in a sense that like this is how much money this represents in the system, but it isn't necessarily going to help us make the decision on how much money to ask for. So I would say totally agree. Timeline is really, really rough, especially with the holiday. And that's really where like if we don't get a response from a community, what we're going to have to do is basically use what we've given you already, so the numbers we've given you for this biennium, and just assume that that's going to do the trick for the next biennium, which could be a terrible assumption in a lot of parts. And this, again, this isn't the final, like your final chance at asking for funding and stuff, but there's a risk there that we don't ask for enough resources to actually meet the need in 25, 27. So if you can't get a section back, like let's say you're having trouble finding the shelter pieces or like getting all the right details for that, we will just move forward with that estimate based on our own thinking and what we've invested this biennium. And frankly, it could be wrong. And so we're trying to avoid that as much as possible. I think the other piece is we definitely don't have this level of information. Like we don't know your staffing versus your ops cost at a shelter. Like it's just not something we really ask for in like focus categories. So we will likely need to use a like a percentage average across the region or across the state to say like on average shelters take up 60% of their costs are staffing. And so we think of the amount of money we've invested in this community, 60% of that is going to be staffing. And again, that could be way different in your community if you do maybe a lot more staffing in your shelters because you have a higher acuity population. So that's the sort of risk I will say if you can't get stuff back to us. It's not the end of the world, but like at a certain point, just start, if it feels like I'm not going to get this done, start to triage, like just start to get us the highest impact information to allow us to make those decisions and leave the other information unfinished. I hate to say that, but I want to be realistic with you all about like what will happen if we don't get the information on that timeline. Is that we'll just start to have to make guesses, and we'll do our best, but like we don't want to. I think there's too many moving pieces and too many folks for us to sort of like try and go to all the different regions and for more information. We'll just have to keep moving because we have that deadline on the 31st. So hopefully that makes sense. I'm so sorry for the timing.
That does. No, that makes sense. And if the timeline turnaround makes total sense, and understanding that this is an exercise, not a final budget, that's is also meaningful. I also have one kind of another real quick question that's not really related to what I just asked, and it's around data collection. If you go to the data collection tab, there's a line down there, I think it is 12, total estimate monthly cost of FTEs, including case management, housing navigation, and service coordination. That's also in the rehousing and also the there's something about staffing on the street outreach, I think in all of them. And I'd like to understand a little bit more around, that's not how we've viewed data collection in our region, where we don't have our staff like clocking into one cost center when they're doing their HMIS data, and then another cost center when they're doing their case management, street outreach, whatever activity they're doing. They're just, that's the cost to deliver the program. And so that's a program delivery cost. And I guess this is a question for how our other regions doing, and also it feels a little duplicative if we have it here and in the other areas. Data collection from our perspective is bigger picture, like who's like our training and HMIS and really those analysts, those subject matter experts that are in the system and ensuring that the data is running the data quality report, sending out the areas, that type of thing, not necessarily the housing navigators or the case managers. So some explanation around that line would be helpful.
Oh yeah, totally. That totally makes sense. If that's not how you budget for staffing, I would say, if so, for instance, under street outreach, if 10% of your typically of your staff's street outreach time is for data collection, entering things in HMIS, just include it under street outreach. Just include that as a cost under street outreach because it's part of delivering that. And then under data collection, definitely I would include like your HMIS administrators, like the additional staff you needed to bring on for that bigger picture, the analysis work, all of the different pieces of this that you need as a part of the work, especially if you can't tease them out in that way. That's totally okay. Just make sure they're included in the overall roll-up cost, basically. So like you're not missing like a component of that person's work. So your data collection tab may be a little smaller than another community who does disaggregate that time, and that's totally okay, just as long as you're getting the cost included somewhere, whether it's rehousing, under shelter, under street outreach. That's totally fine. We just want to make sure that overall we get the right amount of money to do that work. And definitely, I don't know if other communities want to jump in on how they deal with that too, but I'm sure that's a tricky thing you're always dealing with. Sounds like you're in good company then, Melanie. Okay, I'm going to keep us moving in. I'm going to bounce back to the other FAQ. Sorry, can I just do a quick time check? How long do we have for this morning? Are we ending it? Are we 2 minutes over?
We have another half hour.
Okay, cool. Thanks. All right. So want to keep kind of running through this. So a couple good questions here just around administrative costs. So again, we kind of talked about this before. We provided, for the most part, those direct program costs, especially for the COC programs. I think we identified that the LTRA estimate is inclusive of admin, so it's just the total amount you would get for LTRA. So that's one difference from that. And then obviously the prevention we talked about is the total amount you've received for prevention. And then so just wanted to make sure that as you're going through the process, you're accounting for what your admin needs would be from those programs. And then I think this was a good question too, and sort of a more general question as well. I would add, I know that a few COCs have really had to add staffing into their mix in order to accomplish the executive order goals. Like it wouldn't have been possible for you to do what you've done with data, with the hit count, with point in time count information, all kinds of different coordination functions that you've had to add capacity for. So I wanted to make sure that you're keeping that in account as you're thinking through what infrastructure, if you will, infrastructure kind of meaning like the staffing and the regional coordination positions that you need to sustain in the future. And this specific question is about House Bill 4123, which are these pilot sites. We've used a lot of the infrastructure from the pilot sites to make this project successful. And those are one-time investments. They're one-time, I think it was $1 million that each community received. And we recognize that's not always going to be available. So as you're thinking forward into 2025, please include those costs into your estimates for what you'll need as the dollars maybe phase out from that 4123 and into, essentially fully sustaining the regional coordination work. We see that regional coordination work as essential to the role of a MAC or a local planning group, and really thinking forward into the future where we're outside of the executive order kind of context. These regional coordinating groups, COCs, local planning groups, are really going to be an important part of how we do business in so many ways across the state. So we want to make sure you have what you need as far as doing that engagement work, as far as having those expectations of how the grants, are functioning and the work what it looks like. So please please include those as far as your administrative costs go when you're thinking about the overall costs that you'll need. So positions that maybe are currently supported through House Bill 4123 maybe eventually need to switch over to a different fund source. And this fund source could easily be a direct link to that work, because you're still going to have to think about community planning. You're going to have to think about your needs assessments and engagement. Those types of activities, maybe what you're doing under 4123 will likely need to shift over into this work. So just wanted to make sure that you're including those costs as you think about kind of the overall needs moving forward, even if in this biennium, that's not something that you're paying for. Good question. So the 4123 funds aren't listed in the workbook. They didn't come through OHCS. So those funds just went from DAS directly to the pilot sites. Like in Jan's case, they went to, I believe, Polk County. I could be wrong on that. But they, so those dollars would likely be included under your current investments tab, potentially, because that's money that's flowing into your community for homelessness, specifically for planning and coordination purposes. So definitely would think that that's a part of that current investments tab to make sure that you're capturing the $1 million there. I don't know how each community used it, of course, but I think that's the only area where I would include that, and you wouldn't have to include it as part of like your other investments. I would just include the idea that the 4123 costs may eventually need to shift over into other resources, and helping us understand what that shift looks like in the future will be really great. Okay, let's talk a little bit more about the shelter questions, and I'll just preface this, but I don't know if the kind of experts on shelter are in the space today, on these non-EO funded shelters are in the space today. So we may need to get back to you on some of these $65 million pieces. And so kind of just pieces to make sure that we're kind of talking through with you all. So we did include estimates in these tables, in these your allocation workbooks. They're definitely estimates. So we want to just preface that very, very, very important here that those are not your final numbers, that, I know you're having ongoing conversations as, a community lead with your, with the contacts over at OHCS. Giovanni Lopez and Colt Sray are the points of contact for that work. And so we wanted to give you something to just give you a sense for what you might receive in order to sustain those shelters based on our current awareness. But we recognize that it's still very much a work in progress. And so really, I think this is a good example of, as long as the overall number of what we think needs to happen across the state is, aligning with our expectations, we should be okay as far as the projection for 25-27, even if your community numbers fluctuate a little bit. So we're really trying our best to lean into the fact that we don't have all the information on where the $65 million will go right now, but trying to recognize that, like, we know that you have a sense for what communities, what shelters are in need in your community, and trying to make sure that that's a part of our factoring in. So recognize the $65 million is probably going to be one of the more unknown parts of this project because it's very actively happening right now. Again, just doing your best to try to estimate, based off of what we've given you now, is all we're asking for there. And I think that's going to be something just in terms of the limitations on the awareness of the project. We're going to be heavily flagging that because this is actively happening, it's not possible to, really hang your hat on these numbers just now. Melanie, see your hand.
Thank you. I just am curious. We have gotten a couple responses from local providers when we've tried to get this information out so we can give the best possible information back to you all by the 28th. And we've gotten responses that they are actually also working on other urgent requests from OHCS around the youth homeless program, YEHP, I think is the acronym. And so I'm wondering if there are other, if that is the only other urgent request that OHCS is putting out to providers, if there are other ones as well that we need to be prepared for our providers to be working on those, so they're going to have a difficult time working on these.
Ooh, okay. I don't have a ton of other context on that one. I'm curious if anyone else
Hi, Mike, it's
Judy or others
Judy.
have.
So what, YEHP is through DHS. And so that's their youth program. We do have a youth program that we just rolled out the application for, and that is Youth EHA. And that's for 5 specific regions in the state. And so, but those applications are not due back until June 11th.
Thank you. They must be confused because they've all said OHCS. So DHS is a whole different ballgame. So thank you for that clarification.
Yeah, and they are also sending out the same budget analysis tool. It was based on hours. So DHS did get a copy, and they've used it for their youth experiencing homelessness program. That's must be what and we're under the same deadline. So DHS has their own deadline. Well, I mean, we're both agencies have to submit by the 31st. As Mike mentioned earlier.
Good questions. Okay, so we just want to keep us moving. So we talked a little bit about this in one of the last sessions. So the 24.1 million did not allow for admin costs. So this is just something to factor in. That isn't necessarily our stance for a permanent shelter program. It is not our stance for a permanent shelter program, recognizing the importance of admin. So it is really something that we recognize we weren't getting all of the needs met. It was an attempt to try to spread more dollars out to ensure that more resources were getting to different shelters and keeping shelters open. For the 65 million, the funding amounts will be slightly different. It'll be 2% admin for the pass-through entity. So if you're a COC or a MAC group, you could pull up to 2% for that pass-through, and then 8% for the shelter. So a total of 10% admin on those grants. And so that's really the funding that's moving forward from July 1st through the end of this biennium. And so definitely, kind of this goes in line. If those numbers are not meeting the need, tell us what the need is for admin, like quantify it and help us understand what the actual needs are. And that way we can actually, in the future, estimate based on the real facts of it generally costs us this much to do pass-through, and it generally costs our partners this much for administrative costs. So in a lot of ways, we're trying to better understand these needs this biennium, and so this process is really going to help us for the future, so that as we go to the legislature and we talk to them about the needs of community members running shelters, we can better bring those factors in and really say, this is actually what is needed, and not just what we've done historically or what has happened before. So we're really trying to use this as an opportunity to learn from you all exactly what the costs are, rather than just setting sort of percentages across the board. So similarly here, we talked about this one a little bit. So this is just sort of a scenario question. We're wanting to make sure that we're teasing out the pass-through cost versus the cost that you will pass down to your operators in each case. So recognizing that might be very different in each case, in each situation, we wanted to just get a sense for what the pass-through costs are, distinct and separate from the rest of the administrative costs. We answered this question in the chat too. So the $24.1 million investment for the non-EO funded shelters under 5511 does include the 3-month extension. And so we wanted to make sure that was part of what numbers we were giving you. Those dollars are going out as we speak and over the last few weeks to make sure that the dollars are getting into the hands of the shelter operators as that transition happens into the role where the MAP or local planning group will actually administer the funds directly to the operators. Couple other pieces. I want to hit on all of these, but I'm going to bounce around a little bit. So I think this is an important one kind of broadly. So, and I think Oz brought this up. What if we don't know exactly what the final result of this biennium will be? Like, we might do more, we might serve more people, or we might create more shelter beds if we have an opportunity to create more shelter beds within our existing budget. We just want you at this point to do your best to estimate where you think you'll land with these projects. We know that the goal setting process that we've been using, in some ways is an imperfect tool for you to actually say like what will actually happen. So our ask is just, if you think you're going to exceed a goal, go for it. Say, yeah, we think we're actually going to exceed our goal by 10%. So our estimate of what we'll need in 25-27 is actually 10% higher than the goal that we set. That's a-okay. I'd rather us be in that situation and overachieve our goals than undershoot and not have enough resources in 25-27. So just as a way of us, how we're thinking through this, that's really how we'd like to proceed here. And so definitely, using your original goals is fine if that's the best information you have. If you think, based on past practice and past performance, it's higher, go for that as well. So definitely appreciate, the fact that you all really have the sense for how this works best and kind of what your community is able to achieve. We talked in detail about this overlap and sort of how the different pieces work. So hopefully that makes sense now. Really at the end of the day, it's just, the difference between sustaining the beds with one funding source and the creation of beds with another funding source. One thing I would definitely want to throw in there is that for sustaining shelter beds, you likely bought buildings or renovated or had a lot of one-time capital costs that you had to incur that you won't have to incur in the future. Likely you won't have to buy the building again next biennium. Do not include those one-time costs when you're thinking about 25-27 if they are truly one-time costs in nature. So want to make sure that, if you're looking at your $5019, that was a lot of capital costs. You had to buy buildings and do all these wild things to create new beds that for sustaining the beds, you don't necessarily need to do. So we recognize that maintenance of the beds and the facilities are totally a critical part of this. So do include those costs. But if you're thinking like just taking the 5019 capital costs and merging them into the future estimates, don't do that, because we're trying to, again, just focus on what needs to be sustained. Theoretically, most of those costs would have already been incurred this biennium. So we're not yet looking at the idea of going above and beyond the current system, but really just what does it cost to do the bare minimum of keeping everything going that we've created this biennium. So hopefully that makes sense as well. All right. I think this is a good question on kind of the rehousing piece. So really what we're doing, and I think this is an important piece, we want you for the LTRA and rehousing programs to just assume that all households will need that consistent funding. And instead of thinking about attrition and backfill, really just assuming for the purposes of budgeting that everyone will need that rental assistance continually through the entire next biennium. And that, I think, will really help us just to know, we know that's not reality. People move out of the region, people, end up not being eligible for the program during the life cycle. But I think we would rather, again, think about what the overall need is potentially, and then recognize that it might go down, or it might be stable, or the investment might move to a new household if one household leaves the program. So just for the purposes of this assumption, make that the sort of rule that you follow, in a sense that you're just going to sort of assume that everybody that's currently getting the sustaining services for a rehousing program or LTRA will continue to need that into the future, because it's very difficult to know exactly what the attrition rate will be. If you have details on the attrition rates that you expect or whatever, by all means throw that in there. But we're really just looking to sustain what we set up now. And if one community member doesn't use it, we could always move it to another community member and use those dollars for a new household. We talked a little bit about unit access last time. And so this is a tricky one. If you're doing unit access work like block leasing, definitely want to make sure you're including those costs. I think this is really where, like, if you're block leasing work and how it's distinct from rental assistance, the way I like to think about it is the rental assistance is about a person. The dollars are going to pay for a person's rent. And block leasing costs may pay for a lot of other things, sort of the multi-unit building, renting out an entire building. It really isn't necessarily about a person. It might be about paying for incentives or paying for the vacancy fee at a unit. So really, it's that's a little bit of how I like to think about it. I know everyone kind of has different approaches to this unit access work that we want to respect that autonomy for folks to do. But generally, that's how we like to think of the difference between paying for rent under unit access and paying for rent under rental assistance. All right. We have a couple prevention questions here at the end that I'll cover. And we're about 10 minutes till. So we talked about 1530 funding and wanted to make sure that that's part of what you're getting. That again, it sounds like the allocation workbook should be going out to folks here in the next week or two. So it may happen that you don't actually get the final allocation workbook. The numbers that you have in those estimates are the numbers that you'll be receiving under the allocation workbook by and large. So definitely want to use those as your best estimate for what you're currently going to be getting this biennium. And just one other piece here, I think that we're looking for. I think a good one to mention is that prevention doesn't have distinct categories for like data collection or other pieces like that. So please just add data collection costs into the prevention tab itself. You can just add a tab, an item that says data collection under the additional information requested. And that will help us know like what your general data collection costs are. So I think Melanie's example before was a good one. Like their case managers are just entering data into HMIS as part of program delivery. And so she might, estimate that 10% of every, part of that person's salary is going to that cost, and that's A-okay. I see a question from Melanie and then maybe a couple chats I'll look at really quick.
I was just wondering a little bit more about the 1530 funds and ORDAP and wondering, will the what is in our spreadsheet just like be a top up or an addition to our current contracts, and that will make our minimum and maximum time-bound expenditures a little bit more robust? Is that the idea, or is it going to be another grant agreement that will have different information that we'll have to be gathering? And the reason that I'm asking is because our region has currently been out of the ORDAP funding for a couple of weeks now. So we've been having to get creative and spend some of our EHA or ESG for those that qualify and other ways to serve those folks, and also putting people on wait lists. And we know that that's not an effective strategy to eviction prevention. So it would be really helpful if it would just be able to be added. And then when will be the time in which we have a reasonable assumption we can add those amounts to the bucket, so then our minimum and maximums are still the same percentages, but the dollars that are available within those percentages are higher, so we can serve more people?
Great question. I'm gonna see if anyone from the housing retention team can jump in on that one if possible, and if not, maybe Odalis for.
Yeah, the housing retention folks had to drop for another meeting, so I can answer that yes, it is meant to just be additional funding for those services that you're already providing. So the contract agreements, we'll be amending those contract agreements to be able to include that not to exceed amount. So then you'll be able to hopefully receive those allocation confirmations that Mike said are in the this document will be the same amounts, and then HRT team is working on those contract amendments.
Thank you.
Okay, and then I'm just gonna keep going down to the very end here. I think sanitation services is a fairly small group that are using that, so I don't want to spend a ton of time on that one. Okay, so yeah, this is kind of also getting at this last question is getting at the inflation pieces. I think a good example of just like we know what some of the maximum rent increases have been over the last few years, and like the legislature just recently changed the law around what that maximum could be. So again, very difficult to estimate what the rent increases will look like over the next few years. And so we're really not looking for you to try and estimate that necessarily, but really we're just going to try and take that on. So if you give us like, hey, you know, the biggest drivers of our budget for ORDAP is definitely rent, you know, what the cost of rent is, then that allows us to use our ability to kind of work with our economist teams and try and project what those costs might look like over the next couple of years, versus, you know, staffing, for instance, might raise at a different rate. So definitely just don't try and, you know, do that estimation on your own. We want to try and do that in aggregate. Hopefully that makes it a little simpler, because for the most part, ideally for prevention, you might just be able to go right across the board if you feel like your numbers are fairly accurate to what you've been able to achieve in the past. So hopefully that makes it a little simpler, not having to think about all those other factors. All right, I think those are all from this document. There was definitely a couple new questions that we got today, so we're going to try and write those up in a similar fashion, just so anyone that wasn't able to make it to this can get their hands on some of the same information. I did see a couple requests for like one-on-ones to just work through specific, you know, community unique situations. We're definitely available and open to that. If you just reach out to whichever email inbox you have a question around, like if you're like more on the prevention side, I need help with that one, reach out to the housing retention inbox. And if it's more on the COC or local planning group side, just reach out to the EO inbox side. And we'll make sure that the right staff are in a meeting with you over the next a couple of days so that you have the space. So don't be afraid of asking for time with us. Like, this is a huge impact on you all, and we want to try to support and make it as easy as possible, frankly. So definitely let us know how we can support. If you just want us to spend a little time looking things over with you and just checking things and kind of fact checking things with you, we're happy to do that as well. So just say the word and we'll make a meeting happen. Any other questions in our last 3 minutes? All right. Well, I appreciate everyone's time. I think we'll wrap it there. Oh, awesome. We got our first request for a meeting. So thanks for taking us up on that. And we'll see you soon. This is our last office hours for this project for now. I think at this point, it's probably going to be more useful to do one-to-ones. And so we're happy to take those on and work with you all in that fashion. But if there is an additional need, like we need to get together, you know, another group, we're happy to set another meeting up for the whole team, you know, on Friday or something like that. But let us know, and yeah, just don't be strangers. Reach out with any questions you have. Talk to y'all soon.